The real danger arrived quietly wrapped in birthday paper handed to me by someone who smiled while doing it. It didn't come with raised voices or slammed doors. It didn't threaten me outright. It listened. It waited. And for a while, it learned everything about me while I went on believing my life was still my own. I didn't know yet that a single gift would slowly turn my home into an unsafe place, my marriage into uncertain ground, and my own words into evidence that could be used against me. I didn't know that someone close to me was already imagining a future where I no longer got to make decisions for myself, or that the calm, ordinary man I'd been for decades would soon have to choose between staying quiet and disappearing. My name is Tom Walker. I'm 56 years old, and until recently I believed the most dangerous thing in my life was a failing boiler or a stuck hospital door that refused to close at the wrong moment. I was wrong. If stories about family trust and quiet betrayals matter to you, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes the stories that sound the most ordinary are the ones that matter most. I live in Rockford, Illinois, on the kind of street where every house looks like it was built by the same tired crew sometime in the 70s. Aluminum siding, short driveways, lawns that turn brown every August no matter how much you water them. It's quiet in a way that feels permanent, like nothing truly bad could ever happen there. I used to find comfort in that. I've worked for over 20 years as a facility operations supervisor at St. Matthew Regional Medical Center. It's a long title for a simple truth: I keep the place running. Boilers, vents, doors that stick, lights that flicker at the worst possible time. When everything works, nobody notices you. I was good with that. Being invisible is easy when you don't expect much. That Tuesday was my 56th birthday. I hadn't planned anything special. I made coffee, checked the furnace out of habit, and drove to work through the same gray streets I'd driven 1,000 times before. Susan, my wife, forgot it was my birthday until almost noon. She apologized quickly, a little embarrassed, and went back to folding laundry. I told her it was fine, and mostly it was. You learn at a certain age not to make noise about small disappointments. At work, the maintenance guys surprised me with a sheet cake from the grocery store and one of those cards everyone signs without really reading. Someone wrote, "Don't retire before us." Someone else added, "Don't die on us." I laughed because that's what you do. I told them I'd received a package that morning from Natalie, Susan's daughter. That got a few raised eyebrows. Natalie and I had never been close. She was 32 sharp, always busy, always moving towards something better. We'd been polite for years. Civil. That was the word Susan liked to use. So when I saw my name written on a package in Natalie's handwriting, it felt nice, unexpected, like maybe I mattered more than I thought. Inside the box were white wireless earbuds, no brand I recognized, lightweight, clean. There was a small note taped inside. Thought these might make work a little easier. "Happy birthday, Tom." That was it. Simple, thoughtful. I stood in the kitchen longer than I needed to, holding the box, letting that small warmth settle in my chest. I brought the earbuds to work the next day. At lunch, I set them on the break room table and made a joke about finally keeping up with the younger guys. Mark Henson leaned over to take a look. Mark was about my age, quiet, former military. He noticed things other people didn't. He turned one earbud over in his fingers, then the other. His expression changed so fast it made me uneasy. "Where'd you get these?" he asked. "My stepdaughter," I said. "Why?" He didn't smile. He didn't joke. He lowered his voice. "Tom, you might want to have someone look at these." I laughed it off at first, said something about paranoia and cheap electronics. Mark didn't laugh back. He just told me to be careful. I slipped the earbuds into my jacket pocket and finished my sandwich without tasting a bite of it. That night, Rockford was locked under a low gray sky. Snow along the curb had turned black from salt and traffic. I walked into the house, took off my boots, and found Susan watching television. I almost told her what Mark had said. Almost. Instead, I set the box on the counter and told myself I was overthinking things. The earbuds looked harmless sitting there. Small, ordinary, just another piece of modern life. I didn't know yet that something had already shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to put a thin crack through the calm I'd been living in for years. And once that crack appeared, nothing ever sat quite the same way again. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Mark's face had changed in the break room. Not fear exactly, more like recognition. The kind you see in someone who's heard a sound before and knows it doesn't belong. I brought the earbuds with me again, more out of stubbornness than curiosity. I kept telling myself that if something were wrong, it would be obvious. Devices malfunction all the time. People jump to conclusions. I'd spent my career fixing problems that looked catastrophic until you slowed down and checked the system. During lunch, Mark asked if he could look at them again. We sat at the far end of the table, away from the noise. He turned them over, carefully pressed lightly near the seam, and frowned. "These aren't standard," he said quietly. I asked him what that meant. He hesitated, like he didn't want to sound dramatic. Then he told me about his time working with signal equipment, about how some devices were designed to do more than they advertised. He didn't claim to know exactly what was wrong. He just said one thing that stuck with me. If something feels off, he said, it usually is. I felt a slow, cold drop in my stomach. Not panic, not yet. More like the moment you hear a machine make a sound it's never made before. You don't know what's broken, but you know you shouldn't ignore it. That afternoon, I drove home in silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call Susan. The earbuds sat on the passenger seat, catching the light. I kept glancing at them, half expecting them to do something. They didn't. They just sat there, quiet and patient. That night, Susan asked why I was so distracted. I told her work had been busy. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. I didn't want to accuse her daughter of anything I couldn't explain. I didn't even fully understand it myself. The next day, I took my lunch break early and drove to the Winnebago County Police Station. The waiting area smelled like old coffee and disinfectant. A television in the corner played a weather forecast. No one was watching. I sat there longer than I expected, listening to my own breathing, feeling foolish and tense at the same time. A detective named Alan Price finally called me back. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from years of paperwork and disappointment. He listened without interrupting as I explained about the earbuds, about Mark's concern, about my unease. When I finished, he took them from me without comment and left the room. I was alone again. The hum of the ventilation system filled the space. I tried to convince myself this was nothing, that I'd be embarrassed in 10 minutes and go back to work feeling ridiculous. Then I heard a faint electronic sound through the wall, a steady, rhythmic tone. It wasn't loud, but it didn't stop. When Price came back, he wasn't alone. Another officer followed him, younger, focused, carrying the earbuds in a small evidence bag. They placed them on the table between us like something fragile. "These have been modified," Price said. "Not randomly." My mouth went dry. I asked what that meant exactly. He didn't answer right away. He asked me where I usually wore them. At home, in the car, on walks, on phone calls with my friend Frank, talking about money, about retirement, about my health. The answer hit harder than the question. Price explained it carefully, like he was talking to someone his own age. The earbuds could activate without me touching them. They could pick up audio and share location data, not constantly, not loudly, just enough to create a pattern, a window into my routines. I asked him if that was illegal. He said it depended. The device itself wasn't the issue. The intent was, don't confront anyone, he said. Act normal, normal. The word felt unreal. I drove back to the hospital with my hands tight on the steering wheel. Every red light felt longer than it should have. I replayed conversations in my head, wondering how much I'd said without thinking. How easy it is to talk freely when you believe no one is listening. That night, I placed the earbuds on the kitchen counter and stared at them. They looked exactly the same as they always had. Small. Innocent. I didn't shout. I didn't throw them away. I didn't tell Susan. I stood there until the room felt too quiet, then put them in a drawer. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound felt suspicious. The refrigerator hum, the furnace clicking on and off. I woke up more than once, convinced I'd heard something else, something that didn't belong. By morning, the fear had settled into something heavier, colder, the kind of focus I'd felt before during emergencies at the hospital when panic only made things worse. I went to work. I checked the air handlers. I signed off on maintenance orders. I joked with the guys about the weather. Mark caught my eye near the loading dock and gave a small nod. He didn't ask questions. At lunch, my phone buzzed. "Unknown number. Mr. Walker," a voice said. "This is Detective Price." I stepped outside into the cold. The wind cut through my jacket. He told me they'd looked deeper into the device. The modifications weren't accidental. Whoever did it knew what they wanted. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means someone wanted to listen," he said. And they were patient about it. I leaned against the brick wall and closed my eyes. The threat wasn't loud, it wasn't immediate, but it was real now, defined, shaped. That was the moment I understood this wasn't about a gadget anymore. It was about access, about control, and about how quietly a life could be invaded before you even realized you were no longer alone. I went back inside, nodded to Mark, and sat down at my desk. The day went on, but something fundamental had changed. The calm I'd trusted for years was gone, and whatever came next was already moving. I didn't tell anyone what the police had confirmed. Not Susan, not Frank, not even Mark, beyond a brief look that said we both understood the shape of the problem now. Detective Price had been clear. If I confronted Natalie, whatever she was doing would disappear underground, and if it went underground, I'd never see it coming again. So I did the hardest thing for someone like me. I acted normal. At least I tried to. I went through my days the same way I always had. I checked systems, signed forms, fixed small problems before they became large ones. I joked when people expected me to joke. I nodded when people spoke. I kept my voice steady. Years around machinery teach you that panic travels through the smallest vibrations. People aren't that different. That night, I took the earbuds out of the drawer and set them on the kitchen counter. Susan was sorting mail. She glanced at them and smiled. "Those are cute," she said. "Natalie really surprised you." "Yeah," I said. "She did." The words tasted different than they used to. Later, when Susan went to bed, I stayed up. The house was quiet in that honest way it gets after midnight when nothing is pretending anymore. I picked up the earbuds and turned them over in my hands. Light, comfortable, easy to forget once they were in. I put them on. They fit so easily it almost made me laugh. No resistance, no warning. I walked through the house talking the way I always did, about the furnace filter, about dinner the next night, about the neighbor's dog barking again. I said nothing important. I was just listening to the sound of my own voice, testing whether fear had changed it. Then I sat at the kitchen table and said clearly I should probably look into changing my beneficiary. I waited. Nothing happened. Of course it didn't. Whoever was listening wasn't sitting in my kitchen leaning forward with interest. They were somewhere else letting the information collect. If you've ever had a moment where something small suddenly felt very wrong, you probably know the feeling I'm talking about. If this part of the story resonates with you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to support stories like this, take a moment to like the video. The next morning, Susan was quiet over coffee. Halfway through breakfast, her phone buzzed. She frowned at the screen. "That's odd," she said. "Natalie asked how you're feeling. Said you sounded tired the last time you talked. I haven't talked to her," I said. Susan hesitated. "Just a beat too long." Oh, maybe she meant before that. My chest tightened, slow and deliberate. I nodded and went to work. That afternoon, I stopped by the police station again. Detective Price listened as I told him about the timing, the comment, the unease creeping into places it didn't belong. He didn't look surprised. "Observation," he said. "That's what you're doing now." "So I wait?" I asked. "You document," he replied. "And you let people show you who they are." Waiting had never been my strength. Fixing things was, but there are problems you don't fix by tightening bolts or replacing parts. You fix them by understanding how they move. The next day I tried again. I wore the earbuds on my walk to work and talked to myself the way I often did, narrating problems out loud. I mentioned the out-of-state vacation property I'd once considered selling. I said it casually, like it was an old thought drifting back. At noon, nothing happened. At 2 o'clock, my phone buzzed. "Hey Tom," Natalie's text read, "Random question. Are you still thinking about selling that place in Florida?" I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. Then I typed back, slowly. "Not sure. Still figuring things out." The world didn't end. That somehow made it worse. That evening, Natalie showed up at the house with a container of soup. Susan looked genuinely surprised. I was careful to mirror that surprise, even though my stomach had already knotted itself into something tight and cold. "I was in the area," Natalie said, smiling too widely. "Thought I'd check on you?" "I'm fine," I said. She tilted her head. "Mom said you sounded tired lately." Susan looked at her confused. "I didn't say that." Natalie waved it off. "I just worry. You know, at your age." There it was, soft, casual, wrapped in concern. We ate together at the kitchen table. Natalie asked about my sleep, my stress levels, whether work had been harder lately. I answered honestly where I could, and vaguely where I couldn't. All the while, I could feel the earbuds warm against my ears like they were alive. After she left, Susan sighed. "She's just trying to be helpful, I know," I said. "And I meant it in the way you mean something when you want it to be true." Over the next 2 days, I fed the line carefully. I talked about paperwork feeling overwhelming, about forgetting small things, about how nice it would be to have help sometimes. Each time Natalie reacted, a text, a call, a suggestion offered just a little too quickly, once I pushed too far. I said out loud in the car that I'd almost forgotten to pay the electric bill. The fear hit me immediately. I shouldn't have said that. Fear makes you sloppy. That evening, Susan asked, "Did you pay the electric?" "Of course," I said. "A second too late?" She frowned. "Natalie mentioned something about you forgetting bills." The room went very still. That was when suspicions stopped being theoretical. Patterns don't lie. Coincidences repeat until they stop being coincidences at all. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of what I was doing. Lying on purpose, manipulating conversations, turning my own life into a test case. I hated it. I told myself it was necessary. That didn't make it feel clean. But by morning, something else had settled in alongside the fear. Clarity. This wasn't about curiosity. It wasn't about concern. It was about control. And now, finally, I wasn't just guessing anymore. I was proving it. By the 4th day, the house no longer felt neutral. Nothing had changed physically. The walls were the same. The furniture sat where it always had. But there was a new tension in the air, thin and constant, like a low electrical hum you couldn't shut off. I'd spent my life trusting spaces, homes, workplaces, systems that behaved the way they were supposed to. Now, every room felt like it was leaning in, listening. Natalie's presence grew without her being there. Texts arrived early in the morning, framed as concern. Calls came in the evening just to check in. She didn't ask anything directly. She didn't have to. She knew which questions would land because she already knew the answers I'd spoken out loud days earlier. Susan noticed the change before she understood it. She mentioned Natalie more often, brought up things her daughter had said, small comments that sounded harmless on their own. That was the part that unsettled me most. There was no dramatic shift, no obvious manipulation, just a steady drip of suggestion. "She thinks you've been pushing yourself too hard," Susan said one night while we folded laundry. "I told her you've always been like that." I nodded. My hands kept moving, folding shirts into neat stacks. "I have." Susan hesitated, then added, "She just worries. You know how she is." I did know. Natalie worried in ways that came with direction, with solutions already prepared. The next morning, I wore the earbuds again. Not constantly, just enough. I talked about headaches, about paperwork piling up, about how I hated dealing with forms and deadlines now more than I used to. Each sentence felt like sandpaper against my pride. I'd spent decades being the person others relied on, the one who remembered schedules, the one who fixed things before anyone noticed they were broken. By lunchtime, my phone buzzed. Natalie again. "Hey, Tom," she wrote. "Mom mentioned you've been overwhelmed lately. If you ever want help organizing stuff, I'm happy to step in." Mom mentioned. The words sat there longer than they should have. That evening, Susan brought it up herself, carefully, like she was handling something fragile. Natalie offered to help with paperwork, she said, just until things slow down. I looked at her. Really looked. She wasn't accusing me. She wasn't doubting me. She was trying to be practical. That hurt more than anger would have. "I'm managing," I said. "I know," she replied quickly. "I just thought it might be nice not to carry everything alone." There it was, the shift. Not dramatic, not cruel, just enough to tilt the ground beneath my feet. I didn't argue. Arguing would have sounded defensive. Defensive would have sounded like confirmation. Instead, I nodded and changed the subject. That night, I sat in the car in the driveway long after turning off the engine. The earbuds were in. I talked about scheduling a doctor's appointment, about memory tests, about wanting someone with me so I wouldn't forget what the doctor said. I hated myself for every word, but I needed to see how far this would go. The next morning, Natalie texted, "I can go with you if you want. It might be easier." I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Susan noticed my silence at breakfast. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said, "just tired." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You don't have to be so stubborn, you know." The word landed harder than she meant it to. Stubborn. Not capable, not reliable, just stubborn. That was the moment I felt truly alone. Not because Susan didn't love me, I believed she did, but because love without awareness can still be used. Natalie wasn't attacking me directly. She was moving around me, reshaping how others saw me until I no longer recognized my own reflection. I called Mark during my lunch break. I didn't tell him everything. I just asked him if I sounded crazy. "You don't," he said without hesitation. "You sound careful. Careful." I'd never thought of that as a survival trait before. That evening, Susan mentioned Natalie again. This time it wasn't framed as a suggestion. It was framed as reassurance. "She's just trying to plan ahead," Susan said. "For the future." The future. A word that suddenly felt very small. I almost told her then. Almost pulled everything into the open. The police, the earbuds, the pattern I could see so clearly now. My mouth opened. Then she added, "She says you forget things sometimes." I closed my mouth. That was the isolation Natalie had built. Not walls, not ultimatums, just enough doubt to make me sound unreasonable if I spoke. Later that night, I lay awake listening to Susan breathe beside me. I felt like I was standing on a narrowing bridge, watching the edges crumble inch by inch. I wasn't being pushed. I was being guided. By morning, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. Natalie didn't need to convince Susan that I was incapable. She only needed to convince her that I was tired. And once that idea took hold, everything else would follow naturally. I went to work and did my job. I checked systems. I signed off on reports. No one questioned my competence there. That contrast made it worse. The world still trusted me. My home was starting not to. By the time I drove home that night, the sense of threat had shifted again. It wasn't just external anymore. It wasn't just about being listened to. It was about being slowly separated from the version of myself everyone else had once believed in. And standing there in my own kitchen with Susan talking softly about what Natalie thought was best, I realized something else. If I didn't act carefully, I wouldn't lose everything all at once. I'd lose it quietly. One conversation at a time. The envelope was waiting for me when I got home from work, half buried under grocery coupons and a flyer advertising a church fish fry. Plain white, no logo on the front, just my name and address printed neatly in black ink. I picked it up without thinking the way I always had. Bank mail was my responsibility. It had always been my responsibility. Susan was in the kitchen rinsing dishes. She didn't look up as I opened it. Inside was a single page, formal and polite. A reminder to confirm an upcoming appointment regarding a home equity review. Date, time, location, all filled in. My stomach tightened. I hadn't scheduled anything. I read it again slower this time, looking for something I'd missed. a follow-up to an old inquiry, a mistake, anything that would explain it away. There was nothing. Just an assumption written confidently that I'd be showing up. "Susan," I said, keeping my voice level, "did you know anything about this?" She wiped her hands on a towel, and took the paper from me. Her eyes moved across it quickly. Too quickly. "Oh," she said. "Natalie mentioned the bank might reach out. Something about interest rates changing. That's all she said." Susan hesitated. Just long enough. She said it couldn't hurt to look. I nodded. I didn't argue. Arguing would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer. I folded the letter and set it back on the counter. That night, I didn't put the earbuds on. I didn't need to. The pattern was already clear. Natalie wasn't reacting anymore. She was acting. The next morning before work, I went down to the basement. The furnace had been rattling again, and it gave me a reason to be there without drawing attention. The old filing cabinet sat against the wall, dented and stubborn the way it had been for decades. I opened it and began flipping through folders I'd touched 100 times before. Insurance papers, tax returns, appliance manuals for things we didn't own anymore. Then I saw it. A thin folder that didn't belong. It was newer than everything else, cleaner. The edges were sharp. I pulled it out and sat down on the basement steps, the concrete cold through my jeans. Inside were printed documents. Not finalized, templates, legal language arranged just well enough to look official without actually being signed. Certain words jumped out immediately like warning lights. Durable power of attorney, capacity evaluation, guardianship petition. My hands went numb. I turned the pages slowly, afraid of what I'd find and more afraid of what I wouldn't. Notes had been written in the margins, short, efficient phrases, observations, concerns, forgets dates, confused about finances, doctor visit soon. The handwriting was Natalie's. I knew it instantly. Neat, controlled, confident. This wasn't about helping me manage paperwork. This wasn't about concern. This was a plan, a quiet one, a legal one, a plan designed to remove my right to speak for myself and replace it with forms and signatures and polite explanations made behind my back. I sat there for a long time, the hum of the furnace filling the space. Upstairs, Susan called down asking if I'd found the problem yet. "In a minute," I said. My voice sounded steady. That surprised me. I drove to work like I always did, parked in the same spot, walked the same halls. Everything functioned. Boilers held pressure, doors closed properly. No one questioned my competence. The building trusted me completely. On my lunch break, I drove to Lakeshore Community Bank. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't mention Natalie's name. I asked questions the way a careful man would, polite, curious. The loan officer, young and tense, shifted in his chair when I asked about the appointment. "Yes," he said. "We received a call. A woman said she was assisting her stepfather with financial planning." "Did she have authorization?" I asked. He hesitated. "She said you were considering it." Considering. Not signed, not approved, just assumed. That was enough. I went back to work, closed my office door, and called Detective Price. I told him everything. The letter, the folder, the notes. He listened without interrupting. "This combination isn't uncommon," he said when I finished. "What makes it dangerous is the timing. Audio surveillance paired with guardianship paperwork can build a very convincing narrative." "So what do?" I asked. "You keep doing exactly what you're doing," he said. "And you don't sign anything." That night, Natalie came over with dessert, store-bought, smiling. "Mom said you found some paperwork," she said lightly, like she was talking about a recipe she'd misplaced. "I was just trying to help get things organized. For the future. The future." Susan stood quietly beside her hands folded, watching my face for a reaction. I wanted to end it right there, to put the folder on the table and ask Natalie what kind of person plans to erase another human being with paperwork and patience. Instead, I nodded. "Planning makes sense," I said. Natalie relaxed just a little. That was when I knew how close the trap was to closing. Later, alone in the car, I put the earbuds in and talked about scheduling a doctor's appointment, about memory tests, about needing someone with me so I wouldn't forget details. Every word felt like a betrayal of myself, but I needed to see how far she'd go. By morning, the message came. "I can go with you if you want," Natalie wrote. "It might be easier." I sat there staring at the screen, the full shape of it finally clear. This wasn't just about money. It was about control. And if you've ever had a moment where something small made you pause and wonder who was really steering your life, I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. I didn't reply to Natalie right away. I let the message sit there glowing on my phone screen, waiting. There was a rhythm to this now, and I'd learned that timing mattered. Respond too fast and you looked eager. Wait too long and you looked confused. Confused was dangerous. Instead, I drove to the hospital and sat in the parking lot with the engine off, listening to the wind push dry snow across the pavement. I thought about the first time Natalie had called me Dad years ago when I was teaching her how to drive in that same lot. Her hands had been tight on the wheel knuckles, her foot too heavy on the brake. I'd trusted her then without thinking. Trust doesn't vanish all at once. It drains away slowly until you don't recognize when the tank went dry. I texted back later. "Thanks. Let me check my schedule." Then I called Detective Price. "I think I know where this is going," I told him. "And I think I can prove it." He paused. "Careful," he said. "This is where people rush and make mistakes." He was right. Anger would have felt good. Exposure would have felt clean. But clean endings are rare. Quiet ones are harder and they last longer. So I slowed everything down. At work, I stuck to routine like it was a lifeline. Same rounds, same times, same break room chair with the cracked vinyl. I talked to myself more than usual, but only when I wore the earbuds. I mentioned being tired. I complained about paperwork. I muttered about how grateful I was that Susan handled most things now. Each sentence tasted bitter. Each one sanded down a piece of my pride. Natalie responded exactly the way I expected. She texted reminders, offered rides, suggested appointments, asked if I'd thought about making things official so she could help more. Her language stayed gentle, but the direction never changed. Authority, access, signatures. Susan grew quieter. One evening, while we folded laundry, she said, "Natalie's just worried." "You don't have to be so stubborn." That word again. "I know," I said. "She says you forget things sometimes," Susan added, not looking at me. I almost lost control then, almost pulled the folder from the drawer and laid it on the bed between us. My mouth opened. My chest burned. Instead, I nodded. Maybe I do. That was the moment I nearly broke. Not because of what Natalie was doing, but because of what it was turning me into. Someone who lied on purpose. Someone who watched his words like they were live wires. Someone who manipulated the people he loved because he didn't see another way out. That night, I drove back to the hospital parking lot and sat there with the engine running, my breath fogging the windshield. I thought about all the years I'd spent keeping systems running for other people. Boilers don't forget their jobs. Doors don't get tired. No one calls you unreliable when the heat stays on in February. I called Mark. "I need you to tell me if I'm crazy," I said. He didn't hesitate. "You're not." Mark helped me do what I couldn't do alone. We organized dates, times, messages. He showed me how to save everything in more than one place, how to print logs, how to write things down by hand. "People our age get dismissed," he said quietly. "Paper keeps you from disappearing." The next setback came from the police. A younger officer reviewed what we had and shrugged. "Looks like family drama," he said. "No money's been taken yet." I punched the steering wheel hard enough to make my knuckles ache. For a moment, I was tempted to drive straight to Natalie's apartment and tear the whole thing open. That was my mistake. I called her instead. Not angry, just too direct. "Natalie," I said, "why are you talking to the bank about my house?" There was a pause. A long one. "I'm just trying to help," she said. "Mom asked me to." The line went dead. For 2 days, nothing happened. No texts, no calls, no surprise visits. The silence was worse than the pressure. I was certain I'd tipped her off, certain I'd lost whatever advantage I'd built by being patient. Then the email arrived. Subject line: "Next steps." Natalie wrote about scheduling a meeting at the bank, about how it would be less stressful if we all sat down together. She attached a list of documents she suggested I bring. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, she added, "I talked to Mom. She agrees this is for the best." That was it. The proof Detective Price needed. I forwarded everything to him and to the bank's fraud department. This time the tone changed. The replies came faster. Meetings were scheduled, not the kind Natalie expected. That night, I didn't put the earbuds in. I set them on the passenger seat and looked at them for a long time. Small, white, silent. They weren't stealing my mind. Not yet. The hardest part wasn't pretending to be confused. The hardest part was pretending to be calm. Because I knew the next time we all sat down together, there would be no room left for pretending. And the quiet I was sitting in now wasn't peace. It was the last still moment before everything finally moved. The conference room at Lakeshore Community Bank was smaller than I'd imagined. No wood paneling, no courtroom gravity. Just a long laminate table, a wall-mounted television that wasn't turned on, and a pot of coffee that had clearly been sitting there too long. The kind of room where people signed papers they didn't fully understand and told themselves everything would be fine. Natalie arrived first. She wore a gray blazer and carried a leather folder pressed tight against her chest like armor. She didn't look at me when I walked in, just nodded professional, already settled into the role she'd chosen for herself. Susan came in last. She looked tired, smaller somehow. She sat beside Natalie, hands folded in her lap, eyes moving back and forth like she was trying to keep up with something already in motion. I took the chair across from them and set my coffee down. I didn't say a word. Laura Bennett, the bank's senior risk officer, introduced herself with a calm smile that didn't reach her eyes. Detective Price sat off to the side, notebook-closed posture, relaxed in a way that meant he was paying attention to everything. Laura slid a stack of papers across the table. "Before we begin," she said, "we need to clarify a few things." Natalie smiled. "Of course." These emails, Laura continued, tapping the top page. "These calls, this appointment request. You initiated them, correct?" Natalie nodded easily. "I was helping my stepfather. He's been overwhelmed lately." She glanced at me just long enough to sell the story. I took a sip of coffee. It was terrible. "You claimed Mr. Walker was considering granting you financial authority," Laura said. "Yes," Natalie replied. "We've talked about it." "That's interesting," Laura said, turning a page, "because Mr. Walker hasn't signed anything. And yet you requested information typically reserved for authorized agents." Natalie's smile tightened. "I was just gathering options." Detective Price leaned forward for the first time. Options usually don't include misrepresenting someone's mental capacity. The word capacity landed hard. Susan looked up sharply. Laura slid another document across the table, the guardianship templates, the margin notes, clean, labeled. Susan's breath caught. "Natalie, what is this?" Natalie's face flushed. "Mom, it's not what it looks like." I set my coffee down and finally spoke. "It looks like paperwork," I said. "Paperwork meant to replace me." The room went very quiet. Not polite quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when the truth arrives and doesn't care who's comfortable. Laura pressed a button on a small recorder. "There's more," she said. My voice filled the room, slightly shaky, confused, talking about forgetting appointments, about needing help, about being tired. Natalie's eyes widened. "Where did you get that?" Laura didn't answer. "Detective Price did, from the device you gave him." The earbuds were placed on the table, right in the center, small, white, familiar. For a moment, no one moved. "This is ridiculous," Natalie said, suddenly standing up. "He's twisting things. He hates me. He's always hated me." I stayed seated. "I don't hate you," I said. "I trusted you." That did it. Natalie's composure cracked. Words spilled out fast and sharp. She talked about stress, about debt, about how hard it was to watch someone decline, about protecting her mother, about doing what was necessary. Susan stared at her like she was seeing a stranger. Detective Price let Natalie talk until she ran out of breath. Then he spoke quietly. "You altered a device to monitor him. You contacted financial institutions under false pretenses. And you prepared legal documents to assume control without consent. You can't prove intent, Natalie snapped. Laura slid one final printout across the table, an email Natalie had sent 2 days earlier. Once he signs, everything gets easier. He won't even realize what he's losing. The words sat there black on white. Susan covered her mouth. Natalie's shoulders sagged. Just a little. Enough. This matter is being referred for further investigation, Laura said, closing the folder. Any attempt to contact Mr. Walker regarding his finances or health will be considered interference. Detective Price stood. Miss Brooks, I'd like you to come with me. Natalie looked at me then. Really looked. You did this, she said. I met her eyes. Calm. Tired. No, I said. You did. She wasn't handcuffed. But when she left the room, the air felt heavier, like something had been pulled loose and dropped. Susan cried quietly, the kind of crying that doesn't ask for comfort. I didn't touch her. I gathered my coat. The earbuds were still on the table. I picked them up, turned them over once, and set them back down. As I reached the door, I stopped. You should have just bought me a cake, I said. Then I walked out. Susan didn't come home that night. She said she needed time. Not space, exactly. Time to breathe without walls listening. Time to understand what she'd been standing inside without realizing it. She packed a small overnight bag and stayed with her sister across town. She didn't slam the door. She didn't accuse me. She just looked at the house the way you look at something familiar that suddenly feels unsafe. I didn't know, she said softly before she left. I believe you, I replied. And I meant it. The house felt hollow after that. Not empty. Hollow. Like the sound had been scooped out of it. I slept on my side of the bed out of habit. The alarm still went off at the same time. The furnace kicked on when it was supposed to. Everything worked. That didn't make it feel right. At work, people noticed something had changed. Not in the way they usually do. No gossip, no questions, just small adjustments. Someone refilled the coffee without being asked. Mark sat with me longer than usual at lunch. We didn't talk about Natalie. We didn't need to. Some things don't ask for commentary. The investigation moved forward quietly. That surprised me. I'd always imagined justice as something loud, raised voices, clear villains. This was paperwork and phone calls and dates circled in red on calendars I wasn't invited to see. Natalie didn't contact us again. Not directly. A lawyer did. Then another one. The noise faded. The damage didn't. Susan called on the third day. Not to argue, not to explain, just to ask how the house was. It's standing, I said. She laughed, once short and tired. I keep replaying things she admitted. Moments I brushed off. Things she said that sounded helpful at the time. I did too, I said. That was when the anger finally surfaced. Not hot, not sharp, just a slow ache. Because manipulation doesn't announce itself. It borrows the voice of care. It hides behind good intentions until doubt feels reasonable and trust feels naive. Susan came home a week later. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside like she was waiting to see if the house would reject her. I didn't rush her. I didn't ask questions. I took her bag and set it down where it belonged. That night, we sat at the kitchen table without turning on the television. No earbuds, no phones, just us and the quiet we'd been avoiding. I failed you, she said finally. No, I replied. We were both targeted. That doesn't make you weak. She looked at me, then really looked. Not at the version Natalie had been shaping, not at the tired man she'd been told to worry about, just me. I didn't want to believe my daughter could do that, she whispered. I know, I said. Trust doesn't break cleanly. It frays. It thins until you don't notice the cold until it's already in your bones. The weeks that followed weren't dramatic. They were careful. Susan attended counseling on her own, then together when she was ready. We talked about boundaries, about listening without assuming, about how love doesn't excuse silence when something feels wrong. The house slowly became ours again. Not the same, but steadier. One evening, Susan found the earbuds in the drawer. She held them like they might still bite. You should throw these away, she said. I shook my head. No, they don't get that much power. I put them in a box and sealed it. Evidence, maybe, or a reminder. I wasn't sure yet. Natalie's name became something we didn't avoid but didn't circle either. Susan mourned the daughter she thought she had. I mourned the trust I'd given freely. Both losses were real. Neither needed to be weaponized. What surprised me most wasn't how close I'd come to losing control of my life. It was how quietly it almost happened. No shouting, no ultimatums, just concern stacked on concern until doubt felt like fact. That's how people disappear without anyone noticing. Susan and I learned to speak again without translating our words through someone else's intentions. We learned that asking questions isn't betrayal, that listening doesn't mean surrender, that love, when it's healthy, doesn't need to manage you to keep you safe. Sometimes late at night, Susan reaches for my hand like she's checking to make sure I'm still there. I squeeze back. We don't say anything. We don't need to. I still work at the hospital. Systems still break. Doors still stick at the wrong moment. But now, when something feels off, I don't dismiss it just because it's quiet. Because the most dangerous things I've learned don't arrive loudly. They arrive smiling. If this story made you pause, if it reminded you to listen a little closer or trust your instincts a little sooner, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Like if this story resonated, share it with someone who might need it. Subscribe for more quiet stories that matter. And leave a comment sometimes. Speaking up is how we keep each other from disappearing. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: growing older doesn't make you weaker. It just teaches you how important it is to stay present, especially when the world tells you to fade quietly into the background.